There you
Okay,
go.
here we go. And we're recording this morning with Pastor Dale Witherington on this chilly March 29th, the second day of the lockdown in Minnesota. And I have to admit, it's Sunday morning. It's a little bit of a confessional for me. I'm feeling a little bit guilt ridden because I turned my furnace back on yesterday. And for a Minnesotan to turn their furnace back on March 27th at the end of the month, or 28th yesterday, a little bit reprehensible. I wanted to say we're going to speak about Phil Haney, the author of See Something, Say Nothing. Minnesota was near and dear to his heart. He came here many times, and he had the pleasure of meeting a whole lot of people, and Pastor Witherington's one of them. And I was wondering, what would you say to eulogize the life of this fantastic patriot and friend, Philip Haney?
Well, first of all, thank you, Wes, for having me on. I count it a real privilege and an honor because I know some of the others whom you have invited to do the same thing, like Jim Simpson, for instance. Um, and the first time I met Phil, he and Jim were doing a tour here in Minnesota, and that must have been, gosh, 2 or 3 years ago. And they were here not far from my home, just out in a suburb of the Twin Cities. It was quite the meeting that night. It was prior to a political campaign here in Minnesota, and I had never heard of Phil prior to that night, apart from the fact that he was coming in with Jim. I knew Jim's name from the days that he served in the Reagan administration, deep in the bowels of the White House. And when I approached Jim that night and told him that, he couldn't believe me. And Jim and I have become, uh, I won't say close friends, but we've become pretty good friends because of other events that we have been at together, and where he's had tables, where he's spoken, where I have been part of the crowd, not part of the speaking team there. Uh, but it was 11:44 p.m. on a Friday night, and I don't know now. I'm kind of losing the track of time. It must be 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I happened to be getting ready for bed, and my phone buzzed, and I looked down, and it's an email from Jim Simpson saying that Phil Haney's body had been found and that he had been murdered. And there were other details that he had given, but at that point they were speculative details. Um, I immediately texted Jim and asked him, "Is this for real?" Um, and I got back the unfortunate, "Yes, it is." Um, which I watched the clip that you did with Jim, and when he got the first word, he said he, in essence, had done the same thing from the source that contacted him. Is this real or is it a joke? I think that's just the kind of standard reaction that so many of us had. Uh, the shock of the idea that the things Phil had talked about for a long time, the things that he had said publicly from stage about, if you ever find my body in such and such a state, don't ever believe it was suicide. Um, and people would not know how to take that. If you're in the crowd and you're hearing that, you don't know if you've got a guy who's got just kind of that sick sense of humor that a lot of um, cops have, a lot of law enforcement people have. And I'll tell you, I don't know about you, but I've had the privilege of hanging around with a lot of law enforcement people in my lifetime. And
Yeah.
if there's one thing they have, a very sick, warped sense of humor. So we didn't know. It was still being somewhat humorous. We know I'm being, deadly serious. Unfortunately, it was being very serious. Here was a man dedicated to the service of his God and the service of his country. I mean, good grief. He was, if I remember correctly, initially as a profession, he was a scientist. He was an agricultural scientist, and I could be there. But he spent 15 years in Arabic countries, and he was a student of the cultures. He was a student of the societies. He became a student of all the things that were important to the people with whom he worked and those nations where he worked on those assignments. And that's what made him such an excellent fit to help become one of the first officers in our Department of Homeland Security. And the detail with which he carried out his work prior to entering the service is what made his service so outstanding for us. When I heard Phil speak that very first night, I got his book right away, the book you held up, See Something, Say Nothing. I brought it home, started reading it, and I could not put it down, not just because of the style with which Phil wrote, but the information he was sharing. And while many of us have often wondered what goes on behind the scenes in government, what are some of the depths to which it operates on a very secretive basis in a very positive way for our nation, and to the depths it operates on a secretive basis in an evil, negative way. We don't know. Unless we're involved directly on a day-by-day basis, we just don't know what goes on in that world of privacy and clandestine services and the types of work that people like a Phil Haney was required to do. And here is a man that helped prevent and bring to justice, I think it was something in the neighborhood of 300 terrorists and terrorist acts against the United States of America. And I don't know about you, you're sitting there sipping your coffee, and I'm sitting here sipping my vitamin drink. And while we were sipping our drinks, he was preventing bombs from going off, or suicidal attempts or takedowns of people or buildings or entities here right on our soil. And yet he was one of the most humble, quiet, respectful human beings I've had the privilege of ever meeting. I got to know him a little bit better because, as you said, he came here several times. He was here certainly for a long period of time during the 2018 election cycle, the campaigns during that time. And it's because of what he knew, what he reported in his book, the things that he knew that was going on that were actual attempts to take down our country and to take it down from within. And for those who might be watching this who are kind of outside the circle, if you will, I mean, the people who are inside the circle, they know this information that I've just shared deeper and back and forwards, and maybe even better than I do in some cases, or at least as well. But there may be some people who get a hold of this on YouTube or whatever, and they go, there's a bunch of conspiracy theorists, and there's this, that, and the other thing. It's not really a conspiracy theorist when you have the actual documents, you're holding them in your hands. One of the things that has happened to me since those first meetings with Phil is having been brought into a circle of what I consider to be some significant patriotic men and women, many who have served in very high levels of the military, of our clandestine services, of other intelligence agencies. These people love America. They loved defending our nation, and even though they might not be in those positions today, they continue to do so. And because of my relationship with some of those folks, I have I've got stacks, I've got piles of hard copy evidence, the type of thing that Phil talked about. Now, I don't have the names. I don't have any, but I do have the FBI declassified documents that anybody can get from Center for Security Policy or other locations. I've been through some high level training and education, and Phil was part of that. And it's because of the types of things that he knew and the types of things that he taught that got much of a circle of people got our blood going a little bit, because we believe our nation is under attack, and it's under attack not from those shouting from overseas, death to America, and many of them are, but it's those who are living amongst us who are saying death to America when they wake up in the morning and as they go through their day and before they go to bed at night, and they're living their lives plotting and strategizing how they can be a part of bringing death to America. And Phil Haney was one of those men who dedicated his life and perhaps ended up giving his life in the service of his nation because of those who would want to say death to America. So
one of the documents, in fact, that you're making reference to, because he was an original source material kind of guy. I mean, he provided footnotes and endnotes and documentation. So one of them, of course, is the memorandum that was captured. It's now part of the federal judicial record. It's an explanatory memorandum on the general strategic goal for the group in North America. And it's of course, the documents that are from the Holy Land Foundation trial. and Haney would distribute these and he would inform us, and he'd put these into his PowerPoints so people would say, look, this is what it's about. I'm not just writing a film script here for Hollywood. This is actually happening.
You're very right, Wes. In fact, I'm looking up over my computer onto a bookshelf across my room from me, and sitting on that shelf is a copy of that same explanatory memorandum. That was a document that was created by the Muslim Brotherhood in North America in 1991, and it was discovered in the midst of a raid at a home in Virginia in 2004, and that was just one of thousands of documents that led to that Holy Land Foundation trial that you're talking about that took place in 2008. And if I remember correctly, that foundation, which was advertising itself as just a philanthropic group, was indicted on 108 counts of things like sedition and the whatever the legal terminology is. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a forensic legal specialist, but it was proven and it convicted 108 convictions that this was an organization that was existing specifically to infiltrate and take down the United States of America from within. And Jim Simpson mentioned that when he first got the word about Phil's death, that he called John Guandolo. John has been my primary mentor for years now in this whole thing. I stay in contact with John on a fairly regular basis. The information that he had as being the number one person in the intelligence community of the United States, who educated all of our intelligence community, educated our Joint Chiefs of Staff, put together the maps and the descriptions, and to the point where the Joint Chiefs' initial response was, this is an incursion against the United States of America. Well, it was people like Phil who existed to fight off this incursion. It was people like Phil, and Phil himself, not just like it was Phil who had his team, who made sure that certain people were taken off the streets so that our communities were safe, our nation was safe. And the information Phil had, in addition to that explanatory memorandum, and you've heard me give my talk, America at a Crossroads, where I talk about the fact that we all operate on a particular playbook. I used, you might remember I used my college football experience. The fact that when I showed up at football camp in college, I was expected to show up in shape and expected to know my playbook, because every week when we prepared for the next game, we were studying our opponent's playbook. So we were prepared. We were ready for our opponents. We knew what to do, and we could take away their advantage on the field. And so people who would scream at Phil as being a conspiracy nut or an Islamophobe or whatever the case may be, well, the word Islamophobe means fear of Islam. If you understand your enemy's playbook, you don't fear your enemy. You fear your enemy when you know that they're actively working against you, but you have no idea what they're doing. Then you're in fear. Phil did not live in fear. Phil was not instilling fear. Phil was giving us the information on the enemy's playbook that the enemy himself wrote. And so we're able to study the enemies of the United States of America, and we are able to come up with offensive and defensive strategies because of men like Phil Haney. Now, when I say offensive strategies, you pointed out to me when you and I spoke for a few minutes last night, and people will see it over my shoulder. There are two big wooden flags hanging on my wall. One is the United States flag. The other people might not recognize. I'm going to move a little bit, but that white flag with the blue corner, which you maybe don't see in that blue, is a deep red cross. And I don't know how clear that is, but that is the Christian flag. There's a spot on my wall that sits next to that for the Jewish flag that's about to arrive. So I'm looking forward to that. But when I say offense, here's what I mean. As a pastor, just as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ, I believe our number one offensive move, and I believe this represented Phil as well. People who don't know Jesus Christ personally are lost. They don't know ultimate truth. They don't even know that ultimate truth really exists. People need to know Jesus. And so our offensive strategy is, how do we take the knowledge of Jesus and share that with those who don't know them, so that those people who don't know him have an opportunity to get to know him, to get to know who he is. And there are a lot more lost people, whether they are Islamic, whether they are democratic socialists, whether they're communists, whatever they're atheists, whatever their belief system is. There's a very, very high percentage of those who are actually pretty benign. They're going through their daily lives with their beliefs, as you and I go through our daily lives with our beliefs. They're in some states like you and I today are stay at home. I guess you get to go to work, though. You're essential.
Yeah, I have to work.
Yeah.
I don't mean to brag, but
I'm a pastor, so I'm non-essential. So I'll stay at home today.
Shut down the churches. Yeah. No, but
our church is live streaming. But the point is,
they are live streaming.
the offense is the gospel. But what many of our folks don't understand is we also need to have a really good defense. A good defense just means prepared to stop the advances of our opponent or our enemies. And we have to understand that we have enemies here in the United States. We have people here who dislike our nation, who dislike what we believe, who dislike our values and what we stand for. And many of them have infiltrated to the highest levels of our federal government, but they've also infiltrated into our state and local governments. They've infiltrated into our political parties. They're involved in our school systems. They're spreading ideologies that are targeting our children, our young adults, to prepare those kids for destroying our nation from within. That's the goal of the explanatory memorandum in Muslim Brotherhood. It's the goal of communist China. It's the goal of communism, period. It's the taking down of America from within. And it's the taking down of America from our morality, our patriotism, and our spirituality. That was Stalin. That's what he said had to happen.
There's an article.
Phil Haney.
Times 3 days ago that there's an article in the New York Times 3 days ago which blames Christians for the spread of the
Yeah,
Wu flu throughout the United States of America. So the propaganda never ends from the fifth column. But you were
right.
about to say something else about Phil Haney. One other thing that ties in with what you're saying is that he was always careful to tell us, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, because
Yes.
he wasn't encouraging anyone to get pitchforks and torches and start rallying. He was trying to say, here is what's going on. And he did that with a very peaceful demeanor. It was never feisty or storm the barricades. It was a very peaceful manner, very Christ-like in a sense. Yeah.
Very much so. And when you're filled with the kind of knowledge that he was filled with, and was completely confident in that knowledge, and that's again where I use my football playbook analogy. When I know my opponent's playbook as well as my opponent does, when I step out on the field, I am not fearful. I can step out onto the field of play confidently and with a sense of peace to get my job done. Phil knew his stuff, and he knew his primary job as a DHS officer was to take the knowledge he had and to apply it so that we could stop terrorist acts in the United States. And when he was no longer with the DHS, he could take that same knowledge, the same experience, and he could educate people like you and like me and like the many hundreds of others that he continued to educate, so we could raise up um, an army, if you will, of equipped Americans so that we need not live in fear. We're not Islamophobes. We're not communophobes. There's no phobe in us because we don't live by fear. We live by faith as Christians, but we also live in the confidence of knowing we have the playbook. If we will take time and study the playbook of our opponents, then we can at least know how to defend ourselves. We can go to our law enforcement, we can go to our military, we can set up our local communities in a peaceful fashion to be able to say, this is what we need to do for defense. And I think most Americans probably don't understand defense really well unless they served in the military. Um, I did not have the privilege of serving in the military, but my father, my first stepfather, and my second stepfather, so all three of my dads served in the military in different branches of the service. Cousins of mine served. Um, when it was my turn to go, I was told we're not taking anybody anymore, but if we take anybody again, you're the next to go. And it just didn't happen. And that was the Vietnam War era. And many of my friends went. I just was in a group that they said, you're not going. Uh, Military people live very, very different lives um, because they have to be defense minded. And the average person does not understand a defense mindset. It's not a phobia. It's not a paranoia. It's a mindset that is legitimate. And so when it comes to the explanatory memorandum, as you pulled out, or any of the many other thousands and thousands of documents that Phil would teach from, uh, it was not a matter of phobia. It was a matter of being educated well enough so we knew what kind of courses of action to take so we did not have to live under fear. So it was Phil Haney who could stand up in his quiet, peaceful demeanor and say, here are the facts. Now it's up to you to apply in your communities what you're going to do. And oh, by the way, I'll stay here and help you. And that's what he did.
Mm-hmm. Say, could I ask you if isn't the Center for Security Policy where Mr. Haney's work can be found online? I mean, many good articles he wrote, I believe, are at their website.
I think
But along with you can download a PDF version of the explanatory memorandum and many other documents from the Muslim Brotherhood on
Well, that's where I got mine to print off. Is I went to centerforsecuritypolicy.org and I copied off the explanatory memorandum. And I believe you probably could get the documents from Phil. You know, Jim Simpson in his clip mentioned that he and Phil met many times at the center. And so I think there's documents you could download that Phil wrote, that Trevor Loudon wrote, maybe even some things that Jim wrote before he wrote his Red Green Axis book. The Center for Security Policy has, or at least had, some tremendous resources on their website. I understand that they have got some new leadership there now, and some things have changed a little bit philosophically. I think that other people that you'd want to get information from would be that had been at the center would be Claire Lopez. Again, another vital part of the defense of our nation, and she and Phil, very tight. Certainly John Guandolo, going to understandingthethreat.com, tremendous vital information there. Steve Coughlin's book, Catastrophic Failure. I'm looking up again at this, this wall of resources that I've developed, just in the last 2.5 years, that are not just resources from Americans trying to interpret what the democratic socialists, Marxists, communists, and Islamicists are doing, but they're the actual books that those people wrote themselves and use as the training manuals in their communities against us. These are the playbooks. I've got them on my shelf.
And it's hard to, it used to be incongruous to imagine that Islamists had something in common with socialists and communists. But when you see Bernie Sanders, when the public sees Bernie Sanders sharing the stage with Ilhan Omar, that is a moment where people realize that the Red-Green Alliance is something that's real for them. Even if we don't understand it as Americans, why would they have something in common? They do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then, that's where you get Jim's book, Red Green Access. That's where you get Trevor Loudon's material, The Enemies Within. There's a great video series called Sabotage that Phil Haney is on that panel with Shahram Hadian and others that Brandon House put together. It's a 3-disc, 6-hour set. That's fantastic. There's Brandon's newer book called Marxianity. And you're right. Those marriages of, in some ways, antithetical philosophies, people wonder, how can that possibly be? Well, there's that old maxim that says the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they become friends because they share common enemies. Who do they define as their common enemies? Christians and Jews. So America, which was founded on the heritage of Christian and Jewish principles coming from the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, the primary source of the founding of our nation, are principles that are directly tied to the Bible. And in some cases, it's directly the Bible itself. That's the way America was founded. There's a lot of people that are rewriting history, and there are those who are so antithetical to a Judeo-Christian value system that they will align themselves with others who are opposed to a Judeo-Christian value system. And even though they would normally go at each other's throats, they'll unify to shut us down first. And those are the kinds of things that we found out from Phil and others. And we owe Phil an awful lot of thanks for the work he did and for what he gave his life for.
And Phil Haney helped me see that it is those groups such as the Marxists, the communists, the Islamists are not above exploiting Christian ethics, exploiting Jewish ethics to fold the culture against itself. After all, in their revolutionary mindset, you use what's dominant in a culture to change it. And that's been the revolutionary mode from Che Guevara and all of the others who led insurgencies. and calling on Christians, telling them there's room at the inn, welcome the stranger, love thy neighbor, is a way of folding back the interlocutor against his own mindset and saying, you must accept these changes, you must accept these other beliefs, otherwise you're not being a good Christian.
Absolutely, and Christians have bought that line. I mean, they bought it hook, line, and sinker. And the thing that's unfortunate is they bought it because they're hearing, as you said, if I heard you correctly, uh, they're hearing those socialists, those Marxists, those Islamists using Christian language. They're using the "What would Jesus do?" They're using the "Jesus is love." They're using "Jesus is compassion," and all of those things are true except for this. They are using it with a different definition than the way Christianity would use it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing where people have got caught up in that and have gotten deceived and misled is they think that when a Marxist or an Islamist uses that Christian language, that they are using it with the same definition that the Christian church uses that language. And we make that assumption. So we have got to learn that when somebody says, um, Jesus is love, Jesus is the way, Jesus, whatever, and Christians start jumping up and down and saying, oh, we're together on this. We've got to say, wow, you're a Muslim. Jesus is the one, Jesus is the way. What do you mean by that? Well, what the Muslim means by that is Jesus was a prophet who's going to lead the final caliphate into place. And then it's going to be Jesus's job to kill all the Christians and the Jews. Well, that's not the Jesus of the Bible, but that's the Jesus that the Muslims believe in, and that too many Christians have bought into without knowing that's what they mean. So we've got to be better educated, and that's what people like Phil Haney did for us, is to
Yeah.
educate us, and we owe him a debt of gratitude.
Yeah, Phil Haney would often discuss terminology and give little mini Quranic lessons using original source material as well. Of course,
Yes.
repeating something for us to repeat something from that would be hateful or somehow exploitative. We're not allowed to access the original source materials and understand that that's what it's filled with. There's the acts of violence. But is there a moment in Phil Haney, like, is there something that comes to mind when you think of the man? Just in closing, is there some uh, defining moment that you have from having met him? His laugh, his smile, maybe calling you amigo. Um, Also, did he sign your book with the same imprimatur, having done all stand? Did he sign it in such a way? Because he's done this for many folks, and I'm wondering if that stands out to you to have any special significant meaning. I mean, the guy did sit alone in an office for a year while he was suffering under 9 different investigations, and he wasn't allowed to do anything. So, having done all stand, it's like there's a moment of preparation that you suddenly get up and say, okay, it's time to take action and speak out.
Yeah. Well, I believe that the having done all stand, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be, it comes from the book of Ephesians in the New Testament. Um, we're told many times by the Apostle Paul, we're told by Jesus to stand firm. Um, in the Old Testament, Joshua is a great place. Stand firm, be bold, be courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And so Phil took that, um, having done all you can, stand, be firm, and maybe that's the best memory to answer your question in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what I think about from Phil Haney. And I'll give you one anecdotal story about that. Um, it was about this time last year, a year ago, that Phil was back here in Minnesota. We brought him and Chris Gobbets in. They were going to do a series of meetings throughout the state. And uh, because my ministry, as you know, I get to be a pastor to our legislators here in Minnesota. So a lot of my ministry is done at our state capitol in St. Paul, we brought Phil and Chris in to do some private meetings with legislators, do some teaching. And I don't know if he had his RV or not, but Phil was having a heck of a time finding a place to park. And so we were waiting for him, and he called me. So he called me and told me kind of where he was. And so he ended up being around down the street and around the corner from our judicial center, which is, it's over a quarter mile away from where the Capitol building itself was. So I walked down to the judicial center and met him there so I could walk him back to the Capitol, and found out actually at that point that his wife had just passed away about 2 weeks earlier. And here is a man who, they were married a long time. I don't know the number of years, so I'm not going to speculate. They were married a long time. Pardon me?
40 years. Yeah.
40 years? Okay. Yeah. And so here was a man grieving the loss of his bride. And it was clear when I met up with him on that corner that he was there with a heavy heart. And so for about the first 200 yards on our walk back to the Capitol, what we talked about was his heavy heart. What we talked about was his missing his wife. What we talked about was where does he go from here? He was not distraught. He was not overwhelmed with grief. He was not showing any signs of despair as much as it was the logical question, what's next? What do I do now? And the huge pain and hole in his heart from missing the one he loved the most on this planet. But when we got inside the building and walked into the room, and he was introduced to our legislators to do his presentation, you would never know that there was a hurting heart whatsoever. The professionalism, the ability for him to do what he did best as an educator was phenomenal and extremely impressive to me, because I took a seat in the room where I was kind of behind him, and I could see everybody he was speaking to. And I just kind of marveled at his ability to perform at the level he performed, knowing the conversation that I just had with him, but also knowing the conviction the man had for the necessity of those of us who were hearing his voice to learn what he was teaching us, because the battle is real. And he wanted to give us every bit of information we possibly could have to use so we could defend our nation. And so that's a memory that I will carry of my relationship with Phil. And it's one of those things that kind of keeps me going on as well. I've got 6 grandchildren. You and I've talked about that a little bit. Most of what I do because I believe, number one, the Lord's called me to do what I do. But I'll tell you what, I'd much rather be on an island someplace, sipping my vitamin drink here on a beach, and body surfing and let the world go by. But I can't do that any more than you can, because that's not what Christ is calling his people to do. And we've got children and grandchildren and future generations, and everything we do today, right here, right now, we've got to ask ourselves, what are we doing to make sure that our children, our grandchildren, their children actually are raised in a free Judeo-Christian United States of America. And that's what we're fighting to preserve.
Thank you very much, Pastor Dale Witherington. And again, it was a celebration of life event for Mr. Phil Haney, author of See Something, Say Nothing. And his writings can be found online, archived at the Center for Security Policy and the other website online. Maybe I can link to that in the notes when this is posted and uploaded. Thank you very much, and have a good second day of the lockdown here in Minnesota, and stay warm and dry because it's chilly outside.
Wes, thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you, sir.